What you're about to see here is something very shocking. This is footage from October 30th, 2016, in the city of Baghdad. It's an incident that was widely reported in major news media outlets the day it happened, with headlines that look so familiar to us. Reports of people killed in a car bomb in Iraq. Some of the headlines said 8, some said 10, and of course, it was reported that ISIS, through their own media outlet, had claimed responsibility. Over the past 20 years, we've seen the same type of headline so many times that many of us are desensitized to it, and many people in the West, their first association when they hear the word Iraq may be bombing. But something was very different about this particular car bombing on October 30th, 2016. While seeing photos and video footage of the aftermath of these attacks is very common, it's rare to have footage of the entire act carried out itself. But in this case, both the planting of the bomb and its live explosion were captured by a nearby security camera. We're going to watch this footage, and be warned, some people might find it disturbing. However, you might also find that what you see is not nearly as gruesome as those headlines would have you believe. In the beginning, we see a man reaching through the driver's side door of a car before he quickly walks over and gets in the passenger side of a small white pickup truck, which quickly drives away. A little less than 10 seconds after the truck is out of the camera's view, the car explodes. You see dust flying everywhere for about 8 seconds, and you cannot help but notice that there are no people around as this car explodes. Where are the dead bodies of the people who were killed that the news headlines told us about? Well, just as you're wondering that, about 15 men come running into the scene, with about half of them falling to the ground, pretending that they're wounded, while the other half pretend to be in a panic helping them. There's also a white van that's maybe supposed to be an ambulance, and while these actors load people pretending to be hurt or dead into it, you see one man throwing his hands up, yelling for people to come over. You really can't help but watch this and ask, what is going on here? When this footage was first posted shortly after those headlines by a local Iraqi news agency, it caused a firestorm of conversation on Arabic social media. But in the Western press, the story was suffocated, and most of the initial reports of the bombing have been scrubbed from the internet, and you can only find them in archive searches. And for the Western observer, if they saw those initial headlines on that day, it simply would have been lost amongst all the other similar headlines that were going on during the bombing campaigns that took place in Iraq throughout 2016 that, of course, ISIS claimed responsibility for. So what happened here? What explanation was given for this? And who was that man who planted that bomb in that car? We're going to get to that, but first, I want to go back to the very first bombing campaign that ever took place in Iraq. From April 1950 to June of 1951, there is a campaign of 7 bombing attacks on civilian targets in Iraq. Like other bombing campaigns that have taken place there since, these campaigns targeted a specific ethnic and religious group. But unlike what we hear now of attacks on Sunnis, Shias, and Kurds, it was the Iraqi Jewish population that was the target of these attacks, with one bomb being thrown in a synagogue and the other is being thrown at cafes, neighborhoods, and businesses that were commonly frequented by the Iraqi Jewish population, a population of people that in 1948 numbered around 150,000, but now is literally less than 5. Why and how, after a history of 2,500 years, was the Jewish population in Iraq effectively ethnically cleansed from that land? The answer is that this bombing campaign spurred Jews in Iraq to relocate en masse to Israel. And it's this bombing campaign that is typically being referred to in Zionist propaganda claims that Jewish populations from Arab countries were expelled out of them after UN Resolution 181 passed in 1947, creating the Jewish state in Palestine.
Meanwhile, Israel, tiny Israel, took in over 800,000 Jews expelled from Arab lands between 1948 and 1951.
But who conducted these bombings? If you look on the Wikipedia page about them, it will tell you, quote, "There is controversy around the true identity and objective of the culprits behind the bombings, and the issue remains unresolved." But to any honest person who cares to read and research, it's clear that this statement on the Wikipedia page is completely untrue, and it obscures the fact that members of the Iraqi Zionist movement were put on trial and found guilty of these bombings. It further obscures the fact that details of everything surrounding these bombing campaigns is laid out in the book Ben Gurion Scandals, written by Iraqi Jew Naim Giladi, who himself was part of the Iraqi Zionist movement.
How did you and others from Iraq, Jews, Islamic Jews, as you say, come to go to Israel? And what were the circumstances under which you did go to Israel and elected to go there? And what is the reality of the Jews from the Islamic countries going to Israel? And maybe you could address that after 1948 or before. Or just how did that come about? What
some
was the
of them, the old people of the Jews, they go to Israel because they was believing that the third temple will come to building, and the Mashiach is come,
or Messiah will come.
Messiah, yes. But the young part of them, they ran away from the army service in Arab countries, and the other, they come by the propaganda of the Zionist organization. One of them I am. Because in the beginning I don't know enough, just the pressure of the government of Iraq. Then I see I have no choice just to leave the country. My father was laughing for me. He said, "You crazy. This is our country," about Iraq. But because I don't know that all these problems is organized by the British. I don't know that. Yes. Then I go to the, I join to the Zionist underground organization. And after that, I left Iraq illegal to go to Iran, from Iran to Israel. Yes.
Giladi's book includes full witness testimony that took place during the trials, minute details of forensics drawn from over 500 pages of journals and investigative reports from the pro-British Iraqi government of the time. The book is replete with documentation that was known locally in Iraq that not only shows the guilt of the Zionist movement in Iraq, but also shows that the attacks were coordinated with their campaign to push Iraqi Jews to flee to Israel, where David Ben Gurion had recognized that the expulsion of Palestinian Muslim and Christian Arabs had left a need for low-wage laborers.
There was some pressure from the Zionists to have the Jews of Iraq go there.
Yes. When they see that with all the pressure, the Jews still there, they using bomb.
Really?
Yes. They put many bombs.
Jewish Zionists did this.
Yes. They put many bombs in where the many building of the Jews. They put it there, and one it was in synagogue, and it was full of Jews, and some killed and some wounded, and they don't care for that. Just to give them to afraid, to scare, and to go to
Israel.
To Israel.
Yeah, and to fight, if necessary, to fight, because they were very, very dedicated to the establishment of Israel, the Zionists.
Above the fight, I can't say here nothing. But they need people, cheap
labor, muscle, to work.
Because Israel government throw the Arab out, the Palestinian, about 700,000, and they take their land, and they use, they need cheap worker to work with this land.
After Giladi fled to Israel as a young man, he would leave the Zionist movement and join the Israeli Black Panthers, who opposed the racism and discriminatory treatment of Arab Jews in Israel who were treated as second-class citizens by the Ashkenazi ruling class that had been imported from Europe. Giladi spent 37 years researching and documenting what took place in Iraq, and he had his findings ready to publish in 1992. In Israel, anti-Zionist journalists had faced not only censure, but also imprisonment. So Giladi never attempted to submit a manuscript there. Instead, he denounced his Israeli citizenship, losing thousands of dollars in property that he owned along with that, and he fled to the United States, where he initially had interest from several publishers, but all under the condition that the contents of the book be heavily edited and censored.
Well, welcome to the United States.
Thank you very
Yeah, you were. I'm sorry to hear that it was so bad.
Thank you very much. I see that United States is talk about freedom, but here freedom, you can say what you want, you can write what you want, not like the Israeli democracy. And the truth that in Israel, the best regime and the best system of election, but after the parliament, nothing in. Because if you want to write something in a newspaper, you have to take it first to the censor.
To the censor.
To the censor.
They have a whole board of censors who censor what's to be shown.
Yes, and you can do nothing even if you go to the Supreme Court. If the censor said no, it's no.
And you had to suffer that as a journalist. You were a journalist trying to do that. And you were also...
And I feel it on my body.
Since Gilani was unwilling to censor anything, he initially published the book independently by himself, something not easy to do in the 1990s, and something he did at a sunk cost of $60,000 to himself. It wasn't until 2003 when a small publisher, Dandelion Press, run by Carol Adler, who herself was raised as a Zionist Jew in Israel, agreed to publish the book in full. The power of pro-Zionist influence over news, narrative, and information in the Western world always allows for the waters to be muddied when it comes to asking what really happened with any event that takes place in the Muslim and Arab world. Gilani never made a penny off the publishing of this book, and still today it is exceedingly hard to get a hold of a printed copy of it. And we live in a time where it's very easy to search up the title of any book and to be able to find a place online where you can purchase it. I ask any one of you to do that with this book and see just how difficult it is to actually get a hold of a copy of it. Of the hundreds of pages of forensic evidence and witness testimony that's detailed in Gilani's book, here are some important points. Iraqi courts convicted 2 Jews of throwing the bombs who were given the death sentence, but 2 other men, Yehuda Tagar and Rodney Henry Rodney, who were their handlers that provided logistical and financial support, and that were confirmed Mossad agents, both served much shorter sentences due to pressure put on Prime Minister Abdel Karim Qasim by the Israeli government. Yehuda Tajar served 10 years of a 25-year sentence for committing the bombings. Interestingly, some 40 years after his prison release, in his first interview ever given to a non-Israeli, he admitted that while working with the Mossad, he was fully prepared and willing to carry out these bombings. But he still tried to claim that he never actually did it and that they were actually the work of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Those are tough boys, the Muslim Brotherhood. I wouldn't want them anywhere near that government.
Without the suppression of Gilani's book, Tajar could never make this claim to a Western author interviewing him, because Gilani details, based on police records, that when Tajar was initially investigated, he claimed to the police that his name was Ismail bin Mahdi and that he was a Muslim. And to prove it, he showed them that he had a pocket-sized Quran with him.
The Mossad has a slogan, which is the anthem of the Mossad, if you want to call it. It's a biblical term. It says, by way of deception, thou shalt do war. And that's what's on the logo of the Mossad.
The case of Yehuda Tajar shows us Israel's willingness to do 2 things. 1, to dress up as Muslims and Arabs while committing terrorist attacks in order to divert blame onto them and cause further conflict.
Shalom. Shalom.
and 2, the willingness of the Zionist powers to kill Jews in order to serve larger political aims. Naim Giladi speaks in his book about the difficulty that he had in grappling with this latter point, when he discovered that in the 1940s, David Ben-Gurion himself, while he was heading the Jewish Agency, had ordered the bombing of ships carrying Jewish immigrants, killing 250 Jews, and that actually the Jewish Agency had collaborated closely with the Nazi regime in Germany, and that the Nazis provided weapons and material support that was key to building up the Haganah, which later became the Israeli Defense Force. For the first point, the 1950-1951 bombings in Baghdad were not the first time that Zionists had dressed up as Arabs in order to put blame on them for terrorist acts that they committed. In 1946, Zionists bombed the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, where the British were headquartered during the Mandate period. These attacks killed 91 people, and when the Zionists committed them, they dressed up as Arabs in doing it, in hopes that they could blame the Arabs for it, to turn the British against the Arabs and get them to stop negotiating with them. When it was found out who really did it, they claimed that they had to dress up as Arabs for tactical reasons, which is something that they later glorified.
I'll put it this way. Let the National Committee keep on trying to talk the British out of Palestine. We have no objections. We will continue to bomb them out. Now tell me, how's your mother?
Stars, a British command post. Numbers are outside detachments.
The King David Hotel. I don't know of one nation, whether existing now or in the past, that was not born in violence. Terror, violence, death. They are the midwives who bring free nations into this world.
In March of 1954, after an Israeli massacre of Arabs in the city of Cabe had damaged the reputation of their government, a bus of Jewish travelers was attacked near the border of Jordan. Publicly, it was blamed on Bedouin Arabs, but Gilani shows from documents internal to the Israeli government that it was actually done by Zionists in order to regain political favor. Later in the summer of that same year came the famous incident known as the Lavon Affair in Egypt. After the British announced that they had agreed with Egyptian President Mohammed Naguib to remove British soldiers from the Suez Canal, the Mossad, in partnership with local Jews in Egypt, dressed up as Arabs to plant bombs in civilian targets in Egypt, including theaters and schools owned by Britain and America, in hopes of detonating them and to blame it on the Muslim Brotherhood. The incident is named after former Israeli Defense Minister Pinhas Lavon, who was forced to resign in disgrace after it was uncovered. In his book, Gilani reveals a letter written by Pinhas Lavon to an Israeli dignitary who was asking the government about the bombings in Baghdad and the Lavon Affair. It was printed and made public in a 1966 edition of the Israeli newspaper Ha'alom Hazeh. In it, Lavon admits that the failed plot in Egypt was not the only affair of its type, and that Israel had actually committed several such affairs, and that the bombings in Baghdad in 1950 and 1951 were one of them. A former Israeli Minister of Communications, Mordecai Zipori, who was also a general in the IDF and leader of the Harut Party, was interviewed for the October 4th, 1985 issue of the Israeli paper Yediot Haronot. He was asked directly about the horrors committed by the Israeli military. He said, quote, "If you go over Israel's military history, you would surely find out that it was once proposed that one of our planes be painted in the colors of Egypt and then sent to bomb Israel. This would have made it look as if Egyptians did it. We had all sorts of ideas, and there were actions too."
My fellow Americans, at 7 o'clock this evening, Eastern Time, air and naval forces of the United States launched a series of strikes against the headquarters, terrorist facilities, and military assets that support Muammar Gaddafi's subversive activities. The attacks were concentrated and carefully targeted to minimize casualties among the Libyan people with whom we have no quarrel. From initial reports, our forces have succeeded in their mission. Several weeks ago in New Orleans, I warned Colonel Gaddafi we would hold his regime accountable for any new terrorist attacks launched against American citizens. More recently, I made it clear we would respond as soon as we determined conclusively who was responsible for such attacks. On April 5th, in West Berlin, a terrorist bomb exploded in a nightclub frequented by American servicemen. Sergeant Kenneth Ford and a young Turkish woman were killed, and 230 others were wounded, among them some 50 American military personnel. This monstrous brutality is but the latest act in Colonel Gaddafi's reign of terror. The evidence is now conclusive that the terrorist bombing of La Belle discotheque was planned and executed under the direct orders of the Libyan regime.
Viktor Ostrovsky is a former Mossad agent, having rose through the ranks of the IDF's military police and navy. He was recruited to join Mossad in 1982. Ostrovsky's mother had fled to Palestine from Russia in 1912, and his father was a Canadian Jew who served with the Royal Canadian Air Force during World War II as a tail gunner on a Lancaster bomber, taking part in more than 20 missions over Germany. After the war, he joined the Israeli military to fight in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, rising to be a commander of an Air Force base in Israel. In 1986, Ostrovsky was excommunicated from the Mossad for insubordination, and he fled to Canada.
That I speak to you as somebody who cares about the state of Israel, not somebody who wants to see any harm come to that country. And I think that the Mossad is causing harm both to Israel and to the Jewish community in North America.
In 1990, he published the book By Way of Deception, in which he detailed the unethical practices of Mossad that he refused to partake in. Initially, the Israeli government actually got an appellate court in New York to bar the release of the book, an unprecedented restriction on free speech in the United States at the time, done at the behest of a foreign government. After the book's release, Israeli journalist and politician Yosef Tami Lapid wrote in a column of an Israeli paper that Ostrovsky didn't deserve to live. And he said in an interview on a Canadian television program that while Mossad would not assassinate Ostrovsky for fear of its straining relations with Canada, that he hoped, quote, a good Jew in Canada would do it instead. Ostrovsky was sentenced in absentia by Israel to 30 years imprisonment for treason when he published his second book on the workings of the Mossad in 1994, The Other Side of Deception. In it, he details a top-secret mission run by the Mossad called Operation Trojan, in which the Mossad would use a specially developed device to trick America and Britain into thinking they were intercepting messages from the internal communication channels of foreign governments. He writes, a Trojan was a special communication device that could be planted by naval commandos deep inside enemy territory. The device would act as a relay station for misleading transmissions made by the disinformation unit in the Mossad and intended to be received by American and British listening stations. Originating from an IDF Navy ship out at sea, the pre-recorded digital transmissions could be picked up only by the Trojan. The device would then rebroadcast the transmission on another frequency, one used for official business in the enemy country, at which point the transmission would finally be picked up by American ears in Britain. Operation Trojan was one of the Mossad's greatest successes. It brought about the airstrike on Libya that President Reagan had promised.
The evidence is now conclusive that the terrorist bombing of La Belle discotheque was planned and executed under the direct orders of the Libyan regime. On March 25th, more than a week before the attack, orders were sent from Tripoli to the Libyan People's Bureau in East Berlin to conduct a terrorist attack against Americans to cause maximum and indiscriminate casualties. Libya's agents then planted the bomb. On April 4th, the People's Bureau alerted Tripoli that the attack would be carried out the following morning. The next day, they reported back to Tripoli on the great success of their mission. Our evidence is direct, it is precise, it is irrefutable.
I want to take a moment here to emphasize what exactly you are seeing. This is President Ronald Reagan telling the American people in an official national address that he has ordered a bombing campaign on the cities of Tripoli and Benghazi in Libya, based on confirmed messages that the Libyan government had ordered terrorist attacks. All the while, him and his administration are unawares that those very messages were faked messages relayed to them by the Mossad. 40 people were killed in the airstrikes ordered by Reagan, at least 15 of which were civilians. Meanwhile, Muammar Gaddafi and the Libyan government were never found guilty of the Berlin bombings, and the United States refused to cooperate in the subsequent investigations into the bombing, and it took 15 years for a conviction to be held of anyone for it.
And the way it goes is this. The Mossad regards the U.S. as its own playing ground, as a tool to an end, saying, you guys make nice arms that we can use. You guys have things that we want, therefore we want to take it.
Imagine how much of a fool Reagan looked like to those Mossad agents. Imagine what fools the American people look like to them. Ostrovsky describes what he was told about Operation Trojan by a high-ranking Mossad officer named Ephraim. Ephraim had spelled it all out for me and confirmed some of the information I'd already known. He then went on, after the bombing of Libya, our friend Gaddafi is sure to stay out of the picture for some time. Iraq and Saddam Hussein are the next target. We're starting now to build him up as the big villain. It will take some time, but in the end, there's no doubt it'll work. I've never heard of Arabs dressing up as Jews or Christians and pretending to be Jews or Christians and committing bombings or massacres. Terrorist bombing, both guerrilla and suicidal, has its origin in Marxist militias and in Jewish Zionist militias. There was no such thing as any of these tactics being used by any Muslim group until the 1970s. And Western experts admit that it was done via inspiration of seeing the tactics work by Marxist and Zionist groups before. Still, even when the Palestinian Liberation Organization started using such tactics, they never pretended to be Jews while doing it, because what would be the point? Such pretending only makes sense if you're confident that your side can control the narrative coming out of such incidents, and if you're confident that your side can suppress the information that reveals the truth. And who controls the narrative of this? When we think of terrorist bombings, do we think of Jews and Zionist militias who started them? We don't, because when the King David Hotel bombings occurred, and the Lavon affair, and the Baghdad bombings, there were never any movies put out portraying Jews as evil terrorists who committed these acts. But in the 1970s and 80s, after the first Intifada, when the PLO first used some of these tactics, a slew of motion pictures were released portraying Palestinians and Arabs as terrorist bombers.
May I help you? Hayat Fal Philistine. Wabushnia. Listen to the sound of Altar. Who do you think? The Libyans! Holy
I will dispatch the American people to the hell they deserve.
I call now on the distinguished Secretary of State of the United States of America, His Excellency, Mr. Colin Powell.
The willingness and brazenness of both Israel and the Western countries to lie about what takes place in the Arab world manifested in such a bizarre way in February of 2003, when Colin Powell spoke to the United Nations with a prepared speech to justify the invasion of Iraq. In doing so, he had to purvey the ludicrous idea that there was somehow a connection between Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein. To do this, he actually pretended that a former drug addict, alcoholic, and pimp who had just served 6 years in a Jordanian prison named Abu Musab Al-Zarqawi was somehow a link between Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein.
Iraq today harbors a deadly terrorist network headed by Abu Musab Al-Zarqawi, an associate and collaborator of Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda lieutenants. Zarqawi The Zarqawi, 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 Zarqawi.
Powell mentions Zarqawi 21 times in his speech to the United Nations, even though security officials in the CIA and Department of Defense at the time have since admitted that both Powell and Vice President Dick Cheney were advised to take Zarqawi out of the speech because the idea of him being connected to Saddam Hussein was so ridiculous.
Vice President Cheney came to the CIA asking lots of questions. He wanted to know, not only is there a connection between Saddam Hussein and bin Laden, but we want there to be a connection between the two.
We never found any indication that Zarqawi was in Baghdad working for Saddam or linked up with Saddam.
He obviously is.
The Vice President and his Chief of Staff, Scooter Libby, pushed back.
It was pretty intense. We were lined up on one side of the table. Vice President Cheney and Scooter Libby were on the other side, and they walked in with a lot of questions and being very skeptical as to the intelligence that we had been gathering up till that point. The Vice President's frustrated. His questions are all about Zarqawi, his connection to Saddam, and whether or not they had discussed 9/11 and if Saddam had participated.
Bakos says the Vice President didn't like the answer.
We tried to explain over and over again that it would be impossible for him, logically, to be working with Saddam.
Even more ridiculous, but supposedly true according to the United States' own narrative, is that this same drug addict would later form ISIS in 2006.
This man, Abu Musab Al-Zarqawi, the founder of ISIS.
He would accomplish this by coordinating, of course, a bombing campaign across Iraq after the U.S. invasion in order to sow sectarian strife and to destabilize the country. For years, all that the public ever saw of Zarqawi was this black and white picture of him.
That's Zarqawi in the middle. That's Zarqawi in the middle.
But amidst this bombing campaign, speculation was heavy amongst Iraqis and many others that the bombing campaign was too sophisticated to be led by some former drug addict, and given the country's history, suspicion was rife that it was the Western intelligence agencies that were behind it. In 2005, Shia Imam Jawad al-Khalasi said, "I don't think that Abu Musab Al-Zarqawi exists as such. He's simply an invention by the occupiers to divide the people." He also claimed that Al-Zarqawi was killed at the beginning of the U.S. invasion in Iraq, and that Al-Zarqawi's family in Jordan even held a funeral for him. He claimed that audio statements of Zarqawi claiming responsibility for the bombings in Iraq were fake, and that they were intended to push Shias towards siding with America in the war. It was also reported in 2005 that Iraq's main Sunni Arab religious authority, the Association of Muslim Scholars, had condemned the call to arms against the Shia, calling it, quote, very dangerous, and saying it, quote, plays into the hands of the occupier who wants to split up the country and spark a sectarian war. In October 2005, U.S. intelligence in Iraq revealed to the public a 13-page letter written by Al-Qaeda's number 2 man in command, Ayman al-Zawahiri, supposedly written to Al-Zarqawi, outlining the mission of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, who would be the predecessor of ISIS.
Bin Laden's top deputy, Ayman al-Zawahiri, dispatched this letter to Zarqawi.
The Jamestown Foundation, a conservative think tank in America and publisher of the journal Terrorism Monitor, they determined upon analysis that the letter was fake, noting that the CIA in Iraq produced the letter for the public, but never explained how they were able to intercept it. On February 18th of 2006, in an interview with Al Jazeera TV, the popular Shiite cleric in Iraq, Muqtada al-Sadr, was asked, "Is al-Zarqawi, with all these capabilities, real, or is he an illusion?" Al-Sadr answered, "I believe he is fictitious. He is a knife or a pistol in the hands of the occupier. I believe that all three, the occupation, the Takfir supporters, and the Saddam supporters, they all stem from the same source, because the Takfir supporters and the Saddam supporters are a weapon in the hands of America and it pins its crimes on them. Mind you that these Shia leaders are supposed to be the sectarian enemies of Al-Zarqawi. 4 days after that interview with Al-Sadr aired, the most sophisticated bombing attack yet took place when the gold dome of the Al-Askari Mosque in Samarra was bombed to pieces. Strangely, to this day, no one has ever laid claim to having committed that attack. Now, I did a survey on my YouTube channel once that showed that 35% of my followers are non-Muslims, and the vast majority of them identify as politically conservative. This video is really being made for you guys. I have zero animosity towards people who identify themselves as traditionally American and who have generally supported the United States military in its ventures abroad. Most of you probably came to my channel because of my videos on parents' rights and the shared values that we have with you as Muslims for traditional family. So there's no doubt that the facts and details of what takes place in war zones gets hazy and muddled by propaganda battle. But what I really want to give you all here is some understanding of the background information and experience that Muslims have that give us an entirely different lens when we hear about news reports of things taking place in the Muslim world or elsewhere, and specifically why it is so pervasive and common a reaction from Muslims to hear reports about Muslim terrorism taking place and believing that it is either Israeli or Western intelligence agencies who are actually behind it. This is a clip from Akhbar al-Yawm, or Today's News, an Arabic news channel with over 800,000 subscribers on YouTube and 1 million followers on Twitter X. This video was posted in December 2015, 1 month after the United States intervention began in Libya, ostensibly against ISIS rebels. The video has over 500,000 views, mostly from the Arab world. In it, a Libyan intelligence official is questioning a captured ISIS rebel. Watch it with the translation subtitle.
هذا اسمك الحقيقي واسمك الحركي في ليبيا؟ محمد ياسر أبو علاء. محمد ياسر أبو علاء. جنسيتك؟ سورية. ديانتك؟ يهودية. عملك؟ ملازم أول موساد. عملك؟ ملازم أول موساد.
I know someone who's pro-Israeli would maybe look at this and assume that this is someone who's being coerced under interrogation. And that's fair enough. But less than 2 years after this, an Israeli newspaper reported that another Mossad agent had been arrested by Libya who had been leading a brigade of 200 ISIS fighters and who had actually become an imam at a mosque in Benghazi. Going back to 2006, conveniently, after the bombing of the Al-Askari Shia mosque, and with suspicion that he was either unreal or an asset of Western intelligence, Al-Zarqawi decided to make his face public for the first time, posting a 22-minute video on one of those mysterious jihadi websites that seems to pop up from time to time that no one has ever heard of before. If you search online, most likely you'll struggle to even find clips of this famous speech that Al-Zarqawi gave in April of 2006. A few seconds of it are shown in the 2017 PBS documentary, The Secret History of ISIS. I intend to post the entire thing on my Twitter page later so people can analyze it for themselves. And while this video is hard to find now, in the actual supposed history of ISIS that we're told, this speech is supposed to be a really big deal because it's where Al-Zarqawi, the bloodthirsty jihadi boogeyman who's planning all these bombing attacks and executing them, this is where he calls for the actual establishment of an Islamic state and an Islamic caliphate. So it being a big deal as it is, and as evil a guy as Al-Zarqawi is, we can only imagine the type of blood-curdling energy that is going to be brought in this video.
إن العدو الصليبي عندما دخل العراق كان ينوي من دخوله السيطرة على الأمة والتمكين لدولة بني صهيون من النيل إلى الفرات فمكن الله أبناءك المجاهدين من الوقوف في وجه أشرس حملة صليبية داهمة على بلاد المسلمين.
Now there is different styles and patterns to how Islamic preaching is done that is somewhat predictable for someone who is used to watching a lot of Islamic videos or being in the presence of Islamic preachers before. I do not think there is any way that someone with that background could watch this video and think it is anything other than fake. If you don't have that background, it might be difficult for you to spot, but just some things that we will point out and illustrate. Firstly, the man in this video is clearly reading whatever he is saying. Practiced Islamic preachers and leaders of religious groups and congregations are very good at public speaking and very good at speaking off the top of their mind. You almost never see a video put together of Islamic exhortation where the individual is reading off of a script. Secondly, at several different points in the video, he gets visibly tired and he almost nods off as he's reading, as if his mind is not really engaged in what he is saying. Thirdly, his cadence is just ridiculous. Overall, he is talking in a very monotone way, with occasional inflections where his voice picks up a little bit in a forced type of way, like he's a 12-year-old who's trying out for a middle school play.
بأن هيأ الله ثلة من أبنائك المجاهدين يذودون عن حياضك ويحفظون بيضتك وإلا لكان حال أهل السنة في العراق بين صليبي حاقد ورافضي غادر ولكان نساء أهل السنة سبايا في أحضان الصليبيين.
And fourthly, I just think his enunciation of Arabic sounds forced. It sounds like someone who learned the language and has to focus really hard to make sure that they enunciate clearly. It doesn't sound like someone speaking from an actual native accent or dialect. And fifthly, there's a really big thing that I'm about to get to. But I want people to understand that if you're not used to watching Islamic preaching, you might not be able to pick up on these types of subtleties. So I want to compare this video to one of a real Arab Salafi sheikh who is preaching and he is admonishing people in his village for focusing too much on learning English instead of learning Arabic better so that they can recite the Quran.
أن تدخل الإنكليزية على وجهها كأنما قد تعلمتها على أهلها ومن ولدوا راضعين لحروفها وآدابها. عار عليك أن تدخل لغة ولغتين وثلاث لغات من لغات الأعاجم.
So let's just compare. Here is one sheikh who is calling for a global jihad, establishment of Khalifa, and expulsion of the Crusader Zionist enemy.
أمتي الغالية إننا في العراق على مرمى حجر من مسرى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فنقاتل في العراق وعيوننا على بيت المقدس الذي لا يسترد إلا بقرآن يهدي.
Now here's a sheikh who wants people to study language better.
عباد الله أمة محمد صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وسلم القرآن حياتكم القرآن لحمكم القرآن دماؤكم القرآن عصبكم القرآن عرضكم القرآن دنياكم والقرآن آخرتكم.
Now, this isn't to say that every Arab sheikh out there speaks in some sort of loud way, but in general, when someone is speaking passionately, you can feel the energy off of them, and you would just expect something more from some evil, conniving terrorist who is trying to establish a global empire and plotted 150 bomb attacks. But the fifth thing, and the big thing, that is really a giveaway is the finger. Now, it is a religious practice for a Muslim that when they recite the Islamic testification of faith, they point their index finger into the air. And you can see Islamic preachers doing this, and you can see it in a lot of Islamic artwork that's out there nowadays as well. And it is a part of Arab gesticulating when giving a talk to have the finger pointed like this. But the key thing with it is that it is the right hand finger only, especially if the finger is pointed directly vertical towards the sky. Why? Because it is a part of Islamic practice and a part of the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ that you do clean and honorable things with the right hand and you do dirty and negative things with the left hand. At several points in Zarqawi's talk, we see him raising the left hand with the index finger extended, pointed directly towards the sky. There is one point in Zarqawi's talk that is such a dead giveaway to this, where he is mentioning the Iraqi parliament and the laws that it establishes and calling them tawaghit, which is a word used in the Quran for false gods, which you are never supposed to worship or go near as a Muslim. And then he follows it up by mentioning the word of God and the law of God. And when he mentions the tawaghit, he raises the right hand and points the index finger perfectly vertically into the sky, as someone would do when they are reciting the testification of faith. A Muslim would never do that while mentioning tawaghit. And then when he mentions the word of Allah and the law of Allah, he raises the left hand and points the finger with the left hand, which again, doing that with the left hand, raising up vertically, is just not a habit of Arabs because of this custom. And to do it while mentioning the word of Allah is just something that a Muslim would never do. And non-Muslims out there, you might not be in tune to these subtleties, but you all should understand that things that go on in the Muslim world and these geopolitical conflicts and such, you will never understand them fully if you don't learn about Islamic practice authentically. And this thing with the left hand and raising the finger with the left hand, we've actually seen it several times with ISIS fighters, and even just recently for these people who were captured for the attack that took place in Russia. A photo was released of them beforehand, standing in front of the ISIS flag, all of them with their left hands raised and the index finger pointing towards the sky. And these aren't reversed photos because the Arabic script in them is laid out correctly. And as a Muslim, you look at these photos and you just ask yourself, who are these people?
А вы чего? Разве вы не понимаете, кто там воюет? Там воюют наемники. В основном. Вы знаете, что там платят деньги. И они воюют там, где платят больше. Вот они вооружились, им платят определенную сумму. Мне даже называли эти суммы, которые им платят. Они там воюют уже с оружием, все, у них уже не отнимешь. Потом выяснилось, что в другом месте чуть-чуть начали побольше платить. Они там туда перетекут.
So the voice, we don't...
With the Washington Post. Can you run down more detail about how exactly he died, how many airstrikes there were, and if Zarqawi died instantly or if he died later? Just a little bit more detail on the operation itself.
Sure. If you would, technical crew, would you assist me in bringing up the video? I'd like to show you a video of the airstrike on the building that occurred last night at 6:15. The lead aircraft is going to engage it here momentarily with a 500-pound bomb on the target. At this point, they're making an assessment as to whether or not the target had been fully engaged and whether they need to re-engage it one more time. The decision has been made now by the commander, the pilot in charge up there, that they are going to do a re-attack, and you'll see the second 500-pound bomb go in shortly. This is a picture of Zarqawi. As you can see, generally the same facial expression in both there. But that's from last night, as you can see, taken approximately 6:17 p.m. As far as the body itself, in terms of the explosion of the bomb, the pictures we provided to you were obviously, we had wiped off a lot of the blood and other debris because there was not a need to portray it in any kind of dehumanizing his body. the intent was to show you that he in fact had died in that explosion. But there are far worse graphic pictures that were very inappropriate, we felt, to share with anybody that were the result of the immediate strike.
There's been this background that we've heard about splits within the militants and between Iraqis and foreign fighters, and I'm wondering if any of that led to the intelligence you got today, because you've referred a few times to intelligence from Zarqawi's network, and I'm wondering on that, were those people who were under interrogation in custody, or people who came forward from Zarqawi's network to describe them?
Yeah, it would be inappropriate for me to talk about where the information actually came from and who provided it to the intelligence sources.
How about the overall, whether it was affected by these splits we hear between militant groups?
I actually haven't talked to any of the personnel that have come forward with the information, so I wouldn't really know what the motivation was or what may have driven some of that to have been made available to us.
So anyway, needless to say, the release of this video did not do much to quell the suspicion that Al-Zarqawi was probably a fake or a Western intelligence asset. So conveniently, 2 months later, the U.S. military found out where he is hiding and he got killed. And after that, the leadership of ISIS was taken over by another guy who had just recently been in prison. So who was this man who planted this bomb in this car on October 30th, 2016 in Baghdad? You know, it's interesting. This footage was leaked. It did not make the news rounds in Western media. One site that did really follow up on this story was the site Bellingcat, which is an open source news site run out of the Netherlands. The journalist Christian Treibert, who specialized in geolocating sites and actually did a wonderful job proving that the footage of the actors and the pretend injuries had to have been the same place in which this bombing was reported from. He was actually following up on the story very closely in the weeks after. In this large article that he had, gathering all the evidence concerning with it, at the bottom he was keeping updates. And what you see is, at first, he has about 5 or 6 updates from the opening days of November in 2016, giving actual updates about that, and then they completely end until there is another update 3 years later where he's proclaiming that the mystery has been solved, and he links to an article in the New York Times. And that's what you see generally. Even though this video was being talked about a lot on Arab social media, in the Western press, outside of one report that I could find out of New Zealand later that winter, you could really not find any update about what the story was. But a book was published in 2019 written by Margaret Coker, who was the New York Times bureau chief in Baghdad. And the story that Treibert was linking to was hers. She released her book in May of 2019. The story that is told about this guy who planted the bomb is actually a confirmation that he worked for an intelligence unit in Iraq that was the product of the creation of the CIA and the MI6, and that they worked at the direction of the CIA and the MI6. This individual was an intelligence agent, and it is admitted to. And it's actually even further admitted that this guy had the position in ISIS of facilitating the logistics of their bombing campaigns. So just get your head around this. All throughout 2016, you're reading about all these bombings going on in Iraq done by ISIS, and it turns out the guy in ISIS who was in charge of facilitating them was an intelligence asset of the CIA. Now, in the book, they try to spin this into being something heroic, and they cast it as this guy was faking bombings not to fool people in the news media and to fool people in the Western world, but he was actually doing it to fool the leaders of ISIS. So they would work out the logistics with him of how to do bombings, and he would go and fake it so that the leaders of ISIS would think that a bombing actually happened that they could claim. It's not that the whole thing is just a farce and based on lies from its foundation. It's not that. What you're going to believe is going to depend on your confirmation bias. Someone who's maybe really attached to the idea of the United States government and military being heroic and always being a force for good in the world, maybe they're not going to want to let go of that, and they're going to believe the story that was cooked up and told years later about this incident. If you're someone who's been hurt and been affected by all these things that have gone on in geopolitics and just their presence in the news, then you're going to be more skeptical, and you're going to continue to ask questions like, why have a guy fake terrorist attacks for ISIS and work with their leadership to do that? Why not just have the intelligence asset tell the military where the leaders of ISIS are and go get them and shut them down or something like that? Even other questions. Why doesn't this guy have a beard? If ISIS is these religious extremists, why would someone working in their higher-ups, planning their attacks, why wouldn't he grow a beard? That's a religious thing. But the point I really want to get out of this is I want non-Muslims to understand where Muslims are often coming from with this. And for Muslims, I want us to understand that it is okay. We have legitimate reason to see things that happen or supposedly happen in the news, these attacks. We have every right to suspect that they are fake, and we don't have to apologize for them. And the other thing I worry about is after October 7th, you can see really clearly the Zionist propaganda just going crazy. And it's very interesting to me as someone who studied the Israeli-Palestinian conflict years ago, and you kind of study how lies would be put out, and sometimes it would take a generation for alternative information to get spread that would dispel those lies. But now you almost see it. You can see that pattern play out its course almost within a day sometimes. And it seems to me very clear that the Zionists, the neoconservatives, and those who benefit from the military-industrial complex, they are getting very, very desperate, and they are getting desperate to keep the Muslim boogeyman alive. So I am very concerned that something is going to happen in the Western world, that there will be some type of attack, and who knows the type of position that will put Muslims in. And there's really so much more to talk about. Just doing the attack themselves and blaming it on Muslims, or dressing up and pretending to be Muslims. All those are different ways that terrorism has been faked by the Western intelligence agencies. A whole other way to get into it is through entrapment cases by the FBI. I recommend to everyone to read this book, The Terror Factory, by Trevor Aronson. Trevor Aronson was a journalist who began noticing a pattern in all the reports of supposedly thwarted terrorist attacks by the FBI, that they were all cases where the suspect did not have any actual connection to terrorist networks or terrorist organizations himself, but actually all the preparation and ideas and scheming for the terrorist attack itself was set up by the FBI, and then they just found someone, usually someone suffering from mental illness, oftentimes people who've been through the prison system or drug rehab or having other reasons why they are a vulnerable person, offering to them to actually go commit the attack, and then when they go make a step towards doing it, they arrest them, sometimes the FBI even giving them financial incentive to do it. And what Trevor Aronson did was he gathered the entirety of data of every single terrorist case that happened since the war on terror, and found that basically all of them were cases like that.
تقدم شيخ معها من المكان. ايش تقدم معها؟ اي تقدم معها شيخ. يعني مشي ورامي باذن الله. سوين ليش يا شيخ؟